Hey everyone, my name is Melody McAllister. Thank you so much for joining us and tuning into our Growth Over Grades podcast, where we talk about education ideas and topics that matter most to our Spaces educator community. Episode 4 involves a conversation with veteran educator and consultant Natalie Vardabasso. And if I correct me if I'm wrong with your name, but
Nailed it.
Okay, great. Yes.
Yeah.
Natalie is someone I've been following for a while. Her ability to reflect, make changes, share, and grow is something that really resonates with me. Natalie is authoring a book that is about rehumanizing assessment through story. And we're going to get deeper into that. If you're like, what does that even mean? Don't worry, your questions will be answered. And I'm really looking forward to learning more about this concept with Natalie today. And if you're joining us live or the replay, we appreciate you so much. Join our Facebook community and let's keep the conversation going. So Natalie, thank you so much for being with us today. How are you? And can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Oh man, that's well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and be chatting with you. How are you is a bit of a loaded question right now, as we were just talking about before we started the live stream. I'm 8 days away from my wedding. So outside of this door is ground zero for making favors and a backdrop, and it's a hot mess. So I am as well as I can be. The wedding is 3 years delayed because of COVID. So I think the excitement's finally starting to set in, and the trauma of having to move it twice I'm letting go and healing. So I'm good. And then in terms of my background, oh my gosh, where do you want me to start? I was just looking at baby photos out there. So I'm like deep and way back, but I'm guessing you're probably meaning like background in education. Do you want me to go there?
You know what? If any, I just whatever you want to share. If something in your childhood actually sparked something major that has helped you become something today, include that. I think we're whole people, so I love this. Tell me the story about you.
Oh, I love that. Well, an interesting part of my story is growing up. I'm from the Okanagan. I'm from BC, and I grew up in Vernon, which is a pretty small town. And my dad was quite a prolific educator and leader and principal. And with the last name like Vardabasso, I got a lot of pressure growing up. It was like, oh, you're going to be a teacher one day. You're going to be a teacher and be just like your dad. And being the stubborn little Italian child that I was like, absolutely not. I'm going to be Beyonce. And so I went fully down the musical theater route for many years, just completely shattered my dad's heart, but eventually found my way into education. It was actually a mentor that my dad had met in his final years in his career, and he was working on the new BC curriculum. And this mentor was a professor at UBC Okanagan and was doing this really innovative education program that was going to look totally different than most teacher education programs. So it was middle school based. Everything was interdisciplinary. We were learning in classrooms with students, with teachers, side by side. We weren't doing like sitting in lecture halls, regurgitating theory into essays or anything like that. And that was the first time I had an experience with assessment that was radically different, because he was like, share your learning however you want to. So, I have this performing arts background. So I did a slam poem one time. That one really stuck with me. Did some collaborative performance pieces. And it was the first time that, to your point about it's like we're whole humans, I was like, oh, education's like this human endeavor and we're whole people in this space. And so that's kind of what triggered my launch into education. I was like, I'm going to be a change agent. I am the person who is going to, turn this Titanic around. Not that it's sinking, but first ship that came to mind.
Wow.
And then
I think we can make the case that maybe it is a little bit.
Well, maybe, perhaps.
It might have been an iceberg 5 or 9. Yes.
Maybe, but we've got some nice duct tape on it. It's floating along best it can. But anyways, I got into the actual teaching job and realized that, there is some deeply ingrained traditional stuff here. And it took me longer than I had expected to get my feet under me and to really live into my dream of being a change agent. I was shocked at the loneliness that comes with being someone who says, I want to do things differently. And why are we putting marks on everything? And why do we have to keep using all of these traditional metrics? And I had lots of questions, and I'd hear things like, oh, well, that will only work with your students, or, that's not the way we do things here. And I'm sure many of your audience is familiar with those statements. So luckily I've managed to find my people. Turning to Twitter, starting a podcast were ways that I found my community and my strength, and eventually found my way into a couple leadership roles through instructional coaching. And then also an assessment leadership position that was really fascinating, where over a 3.5 year period, we moved basically a K-12 community almost fully to being outcomes based. So K to 9,
Mm.
we had completely removed, the omnibus grade at the end where everything's collapsed into one symbol, but that was gone completely. We had no percentages. We had rewritten outcomes in parent and student friendly language. It was a fascinating journey. And now at this point in my journey, I've actually moved into more independent work, and I'm currently doing a lot of research and building empathy for what can I do that will add value for change agents in education.
I love that. And I mean, that's incredible. And you're so young and you've been through, so much. And, you are making a change. And I
Mm.
mean, that's how I even know you,
Oh.
Um, so I want to mention something that we don't talk about enough, but when you are trying to make changes, when you are trying to do better, you said that you felt loneliness. And I know that that
Mhm.
really resonates with me because you feel like you're alone and you're trying so hard to pull these people around you that you work directly with to come with you, but a lot of times they're just not interested. They have their own
Mhm.
journey or whatever, and I'm not trying to
Mhm.
to make them smaller or anything or make us
Mhm.
better, but I like that you touched on that because it really is lonely. And like you, I found a PLN when I joined Twitter in 2015, and it really made the difference.
Mhm.
Is that something that like did that change the trajectory of like what you really thought your future would be like?
Like joining Twitter and
Oh,
finding my
yeah, and finding your
community?
people. Mhm.
Oh, absolutely. Completely. And I think it wasn't even finding my people. I think that was part of it. That was a big part of it, but it was also finding my voice.
I love
And
that.
when I started Twitter, I didn't go into it with the intention of being like, I want to be an influencer and I want people to follow me. I mean, originally Twitter was a micro blogging platform. It's meant for putting your words out there. And a lot of
Mhm.
people use it to consume and to curate, which is awesome. And that's a great use for it. But I really wanted to find my voice in a safe space. And when you're first on Twitter, you put things out there and you craft these perfect tweets and like two people like them. And you're like, you feel like the awkward person at the edge of the party, like, hey, and no one turns around. So I was like, well, no one's listening anyway. So I made it a habit every single day at 8 a.m. I said, before your day starts, you have to write one tweet. And then because it became habit, I started doing other habits to feed that habit. Like I have a huge note on my phone that's just filled with tweets that I want to send out that come up while I'm reading or while I'm talking to people. I'll be like, oh, wait. And I like run over and write it down in my phone because it's my way of constantly creating. And then the podcast was like, just put that on steroids, that I'm suddenly writing and I'm actually talking to these people that I've been so inspired by, and then framing my own like openings and closings to those episodes and finding this language that would suddenly come to me in those moments, in those really tricky conversations with colleagues or with leaders and whoever that are like, oh, this will never work. And I just have the perfect phrase or the perfect analogy that was right at the tip of my tongue because I've been practicing and crafting it every single day. So that's a big part of how that changed my trajectory, I think.
Awesome. And can you tell the viewers like about your podcast?
Yeah, for sure. It's called Edu Crush, which is kind of a portmanteau, I think they're called, and you mash up two words. And it came because I originally had these horrible podcast titles. I had podcast based learning, cringe, like PBL. Oh, it's so bad. And then I had where learning starts because I thought it would be all framed around questions. And someone's like, so it's about kindergarten. I was like, okay, epic fail. Let's keep trying. And I was telling a story to someone, ironically, and was like, oh, let me tell you about my current edu crush. I just finished this book and I'm so obsessed with this person. And here's why. And they stopped me and they're like, that's the name of your podcast. It's Edu Crush. Like you are so excited about education and you're so excited to meet others who are excited about it. And especially those who want to change it and align with that way of thinking that made you feel so lonely before. So there's love. There's a sense of love in there. So that's where the crush kind of comes from. It's like, heart emoji. But then there's also a little side of like, because I always end the episodes where I'm like, let's crush it, where it's like, you got to actually do the work. Like we can talk about all these things,
Yes.
but you got to get in there and do it. So crush it.
I love that. Okay, so I didn't know that we were going to go into this, but I will for sure put your podcast into our notes. So
Yeah.
anybody that wants to follow along and learn more from you, they can. But yes, and the what is striking me is just that you are so able to be flexible to iterate what you're doing, you reflect on it, change, grow. Like
Mhm.
that is just what we need more of, and not to be afraid of that process because it truly makes us better for ourselves and for the people that we impact daily.
Yeah.
And as educators, that's probably the most important thing to model because that's real learning. you know?
Preach.
Right. You're my people. I'm
Snaps.
so So let's get into the meat of this. You're authoring a book about
Mhm.
rehumanizing assessment. And I don't, I'm a pretty, educated person, but what does that even mean?
It's fair because it's made up. Like, what is that even? So it actually, again, kind of like the name of the podcast, a lot of things in my life actually emerged through dialogue. Maybe that's not just me. I think that's everyone and a secret to learning. But I was talking with a mentor who's really helped me along my assessment journey when I first started the assessment leadership position, Tom Schimmer. And I think I told him, I texted him or told him, you know what we need? We need to rehumanize assessment. And I was reflecting on what was going on around us during the pandemic. I was at home. We all had tons of time to just sit and reflect. We weren't in our busy social lives anymore. I was watching the stories of what was happening with the resurgence of Black Lives Matter and just the critical awakening and consciousness that was happening around that. And I was like, we're missing humanity. Like, where's the humanity? So I turned it into a verb and it became rehumanized. But then like you was like, okay, well, what does that mean? Like, that's cool. It's
Mhm.
pretty. I'm sure it'll trend on Twitter, but like, what does that even mean? And so through our back and forth, we came to realize that what's most integral to our humanity is story. And so then the question became, how might assessment look radically different if we used story as a piece of evidence, as a valid and reliable piece of evidence? Because I think a lot of
Mhm.
people are scared of something that isn't standardized, and stories are not standardized. That is
Right.
basically at the heart of them. They're subjective. But what kind of evidence might we get if we say, okay, let's accept story as assessment evidence? Then what? So that's kind of where that whole process started, and what got me thinking about, okay, what could this look like?
Yeah, and it's so much deeper than anything that standardized testing could actually pull out. But you actually you've gone through this because that's what motivated you. That's what you enjoyed about school was this
Mhm.
different type of assessment that your dad helped
Mhm.
bring along. So
Mhm.
you kind of like you were a student in this and now you're bringing it, and I can say I've never heard of this before. So I think
Mhm.
it's amazing that you got to experience that and now you're bringing it. I hope that it does like flourish because it
Mhm.
sounds like just the personalization alone and to say, hey, I'm growing. We talk about growth over grades. Letter grades do not tell the story. You're giving an assessment piece that
Yeah.
really literally tells the story, you
Yeah,
know?
and it's back to what I was saying about voice, right? I think my own journey is really reflected, as it often is, in what we create.
Hmm.
And as I was finding my voice and seeing what an impact that was making on my own life and my trajectory, I was like, we need to create these avenues for students to tell their story. We have to. Like, how have we not been doing that? Like, that's
Right.
really started to hit me. And so we started doing some market research, and there's a lot out there on how we use story in the classroom, especially as an instructional tool, because it is naturally so engaging. And there is some work out there, especially in the early years, around learning stories. Like they use a lot of narrative structure in their assessment because it's so observational, but it basically dies off by the time they hit middle school. And anyone who's
Mm.
taught middle school or high school knows it's like you just stay away from story. It's critical essays, get them ready for those standardized testing structures. Story is viewed as less than. And if you take that idea that story is viewed as less than in the middle and high school years, and you zoom out to the historical context of colonialism and
Yeah.
the removal of the oral tradition that was really based in storytelling, you quickly start to realize how all interconnected this all is. And if we're
Yes.
going to actually say that we're about equity and about, disrupting these oppressive structures, and then we need to center story. We just have
I
to.
love that you're saying that because those are going with the thoughts in my mind. You like literally address that. I think this is Dr. H joining us, and he says that he's
Mhm.
writing a book that touches on this indigenous models of assessment. And you're right. When we say that story is less than or make people feel like their story is less than, we are not celebrating like where they're coming from. It like cancels out,
Mhm.
what is different, what is unique to them. And so I love that,
Mhm.
you're sharing that, Dr. H. And then he has a question. Why is assessment also focused only
Mm.
on the individual? That may be rhetorical,
Mm.
but you're right. You know, um, well, that's kind of a harder question,
And
but
I can dive into that.
yeah,
That's
yeah, dive
interesting.
into that, and
So,
then yeah,
yeah, as we were starting down the path of researching this, and so we are asking ourselves, okay, what is a story? Like that seems like a basic place to start, but it actually opens up some really interesting research. So when we think of like assessment, why it's related to the individual, we have to zoom out to understanding culture, and we very much live in an individualistic culture. but there's other cultures that are grounded in collectivism. So I can give you a really concrete example of this that has to do with story. So most of us understand that a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the person who is often cited as first coining that is Aristotle in his book on poetics, where he's talking about the nature of the dramatic play. And the middle often has a confrontation or a conflict. So there's this very individualistic, this person's going through a narrative, they have a conflict, they solve the conflict, and there's often someone who's victorious near the end of it. But there's another type of story structure that has 4 acts, and it comes from Japan, and it's called Kisho Tenketsu. And the idea is the story is set up, it develops, then there's a twist. There's not a confrontation. And that allows the story to then reset to harmony because there's a reconciliation that happens after the twist. That's a radically different way of thinking about story than we do, where we're like, stories have conflicts. That's what's happened. That's what drives the story. But in a culture that might have more of a collective mindset, you have this idea that no, it's about reconciliation. It's about a return to harmony. And the things that happen are just twists in our narrative, but they're not a conflict that has to be conquered.
Wow, I love that. That gave me goosebumps. I love that. I want to know more about that. Dr. Dawn Harris actually says stories, she wants to add this to our conversation. Stories are essential to creating a culture of belonging in the classroom.
Yes.
Life is stories, and we are preparing students for life. Love that. Thank you
Love
so
that.
much for saying that. Yes. All right. And so we talk about storytelling, but how do we mesh the storytelling and the principles of sound assessment practice?
For sure.
So it's not just fluff. This is like serious business.
For sure. So if we're saying that we want to use story as valid and reliable assessment evidence, we can pretty much use anything as assessment evidence if we just ground it in the principles. And when we say principles, I'm really saying those things which we have learned through years and years and years of research. Like, this isn't new. Like, these principles of assessment, we're talking about stuff that's been kicking around for some of them a very long time, but definitely since the turn of the century. And so the 4 principles or even the big ideas, you could call it, that I come back to again and again are purpose, accuracy, agility, and empowerment. So if we just start with purpose, so getting very clear on so most people would hear, okay, formative or summative purpose. But if we zoom out a little bit more, or just put that in language everyone could understand, are we gathering this evidence to inspire and motivate further learning, or are we trying to verify learning? And that really is that formative assessment, formative versus summative purpose. And so when it comes to story, it's just asking yourself, am I just using this information in a granular way to keep the learning moving forward? Maybe I'm having students circle up at the end of a lesson and we're telling a story about something that happened that day. That's going to stick with me because that's what stories do. You don't have to be writing down observational notes and wondering about how you're going to capture the data. We hear story, it deeply empathetically lands with us because of a process called neural coupling. So what amazing formative assessment. You now have all of that experience of those stories that were shared, and you're ready to plan for the next day. Or we might go much more robust and say, let's do a project-based learning unit and say, tell the story of war. Tell the story of revolution. Tell the story of the human impact on ecosystems. Actually, we did an awesome project a couple of years ago with one of my colleagues where we did a nature documentary where that was the story they told. So it's really, that's the purpose piece. It's how small or how big, or how are you using this evidence and for what purpose? And then when we get into the accuracy piece, it's really just matching the expected depth and level of learning with the type of stories that we're seeking. And what's really great about story is because it's so subjective, it naturally is more complex because it's differentiated for all of that beautiful divergent learning that happens when we get up to those critical and creative levels. So we actually are potentially getting evidence that better matches the learning outcomes that have always been there in our curriculum, but that we've been underselling by using tools like multiple choice tests over and over and over again. I'm not saying don't ever use them, but they have a place, and it's not for that rich, creative, expansive, divergent thinking. They just don't work for that. Unfortunately, they're not accurate. And then when it comes to agility, like, we are just so prepared to respond to story. It's what we do. We hear it. We want to know what's next, or we want to say, tell me more about that, or what happened with this person, or what happened next. So if a student's sharing a story as a part of their learning journey, whether it's about something from the curriculum, so they're kind of talking about someone else as the main character or about themselves as the main character, we naturally have questions. And the best
Mhm.
feedback is questions, hands down.
Yes.
It's not telling people what to do. It's not saying, here's the 5 things you did wrong, which is something we've kind of been conditioned to accept. The research is loud and clear that if we are driving self regulation through our feedback, which usually comes through dialogue and questioning, people are more likely to use that information that comes up through the conversation and continue their learning. So stories naturally do that. And then empowerment, I mean, we mentioned this at the beginning of the conversation, but that's all over story. Like
Mhm.
the ability to share your story is probably one of the most empowering things that we can do. I'm learning that especially now that I'm branching out on my own, and it's terrifying, and I'm finding the most valuable commodity that I have for my entire experience in education is now my story,
Yeah. Well,
and it's my ability to tell it.
and it's such a rich story. Like I'm just like, yes, I'm listening, and everything that you're talking about, like you're literally living out loud. So
Mhm,
it's pretty amazing. Dr. Harvey says, yes, multiple choice is a good starter, but lacks a
mhm.
depth and
Yeah.
probing understanding. But something that I'm thinking while you're speaking is just like, I never thought of assessment as being a rich tool to empower anybody. I've always
Mhm.
felt like it was this like punishment, honestly, at the end of whatever you were learning. I've never looked at it like, yeah, it gives you
Yes.
purpose and it makes your life richer. Like this is
Yeah.
really to me big stuff. And you're like, oh yeah, this is my everyday, but I'm like eating this up. I love it. So just your big ideas, Natalie, are
Mhm,
purpose, accuracy, agility, and empowerment. Is this what
mhm.
your book is going to be about or
There'll
part of
be
your book?
threads that are woven out. So we've gone back and forth. We've reorganized this book so many times. If Tom was listening, he'd be laughing and be like, "Oh, classic Natalie overthinking." But originally, I was like, "Hey, let's organize it around some principles of assessment," and then we flip back and we're actually now organizing it with we're putting those at the beginning as like, "Okay, here's the frame. Know that these are always there. Just trust that they're always
Mhm.
there." But let's go deeper into what we can get evidence of because that's where there's
Nice.
such magic because I don't think we talk enough about the new purpose of schooling and what we should be gathering evidence of. So, what we've actually reorganized it around is big ideas and concepts. So, we have chapters around conflict, chapters around harmony, imagination, artistry, perspective.
Right.
So, talking about how when we use story to elicit these concepts, we can get at not only outcomes about what students are learning, like from the actual learning outcomes of the curriculum, but outcomes about how they are learning. So, who they are
Right.
becoming as a learner and as a person.
I love that, and now I get it, like, rehumanizing, like, you're as a learner, you're completely a part of the entire process, and it
Hmm.
celebrates who you are. I mean, this is beautiful. I really can't wait for this book to come out, and I will definitely be reading it.
Oh.
Dr. H says, "Sharing stories incorporates prior knowledge and shows how students are interacting with knowledge, how they are
Mm.
embedding and understanding." Yes, thank you for saying
Hmm.
that because it is so
Hmm.
true. But we miss that. I think a lot of times in education, public education, where we're just moving on so quickly, we miss the boat. So much of that. So it's
Oh,
nice to
so
talk
much.
about this and talk about assessment as a good thing instead of just like something that shuts people down or makes them
Yeah.
feel like they are less than because they
Yeah.
didn't reach some sort of, um, like point that somebody else put for everybody when it really has nothing to do with humanity. Um,
Right.
yeah, so let's talk about stories are
Okay.
evidence of critical competencies. And I think you touched on this already, but if
Hmm.
you want to go a little bit deeper into that,
Yeah.
I would love to know.
For sure. So first of all, we should like what are the critical competencies that we need in the future? And I think most people have a working knowledge of like the idea of the 4 C's. So
Mhm.
collaboration, critical thinking, communication. Or they perhaps have a provincial mandate of these are the competencies we're going to focus on, like personal growth. Here in Alberta, we have 8. And so we've included things like managing information, problem solving, cultural competence, um, but there's so many. There's truly they're endless. But and I think we're doing a pretty good job with critical thinking because so many of the curricular outcomes are already written with words like analyze or evaluate at the start of them. So they're already embedded there in the curriculum. But I think the juiciest competencies right now are the ones where it's all about learning how to learn. And it's about
Mhm.
adaptive expertise. Like that's what we need more so than ever before is the ability to change and emerge and to constantly reskill and upskill. And those ones are how do you assess that? right? Like
Right.
that's such an impossible task, it seems like. And in my job as assessment lead, I had so many great conversations where colleagues would run into my office and be like, I found something that's unaccessible. And the secret is, I think everything is, if you can eventually break it down, describe it, name it, do that with students, build understanding. Anyways, but one that is huge for me is the competency of self regulation. And some people would call that self regulated learning. There's
Hmm.
lots of theorists out there that have come up with different models. I've tended to always be drawn to Zimmerman's model, where he talks about a three-phase process that starts with planning and forethought and then moves into monitoring and how are we engaging with challenges, and then moves into reflection. And so then it kind of hits you if you understand story that in our Western cultures we have this three-act structure of story: beginning, middle with a confrontation, and end. So they perfectly map on top of each other in a lot of ways. When you think about how self-regulation is all about conflict, so I have a goal. I am in this class, I want to achieve this. Something's going to happen. Like maybe a child walks into the room, and it's like, how do I respond to that? That's great. I love it. My cat's going to get here eventually. But it's like, how do I respond to that? How am I dealing with the inner conflict of all those beliefs that come up in my head? Like, I can't do this. I suck at this. I'm going to fail. And then that usually plays out because that's how our brains work. So when we pull in a story as a way to talk about self-regulation, we can actually elicit evidence of things like the self-talk that students are doing when they engage with a task. If they had a goal and at the end of a learning experience, you ask them, what happened? There's an opportunity there for a story. And if you accept those stories, then you can actually see like what are the kinds of things that were going on for them. Was it external conflict? Was it internal conflict? How might I coach them along as someone who's built an understanding of what this looks like to how I deal with my limiting beliefs? Like I would say right now, as I'm going independent, the story that I am most having to rewrite is all the beliefs that are coming up in my head. Like, you have nothing of value. Why would anyone want to
Mm,
listen to you? Like, those are stories I'm telling myself that
mm.
I'm feeling emotion because of. And it took me a lot of therapy to figure that out. But I think a lot of us there's been a normalization of mental health and therapy, and we're learning all of this. And it's time that we bring that opportunity back into the classroom to tell those types of stories. How are we working through our limiting beliefs?
Right. That was something that I always talked about with my students, is just like, especially with math, because as a fifth grade teacher, the math struggle was real, but like, there is a way to learn. And I talked always about how you change your mind, the way that you talk to yourself. If you beat yourself up in your mind, the only thing that you learn at the end of the day is how you beat yourself up. That's
Mm-hmm.
all you think about. Nothing is coming into your
Mm-hmm.
brain but that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but as a, and I'm, as a 41-year-old woman who's had to change my mindset over a lot of things to become a healthier
Mm-hmm.
person, like these are things that, again, go back to that whole person mentality. Like it is a part of who we are, and it really does
Mm-hmm.
make a difference in what we put out into the world. So I'm loving that you're putting a name to this. I am
Mm.
a fan. I will be following. I just think that this is great because we're celebrating who we are individually, putting it into a way that
Yeah.
says, hey, we can make changes. We can do
Mhm.
something wonderful for the world or the community around us.
Mhm.
Dr. H shares that he just wants to reiterate that learning is a
Yeah,
process and not a product, and it's an emotional
absolutely.
it's an emotional experience, but it's also an experience that contributes to the world around us. So it is
That's what
so
I love about
important.
story. Story's a verb, it's not a noun, right?
Yes.
Like, I could tell a story now, 4 months go by, and that same story is gonna be different already because my
Yes.
life is constantly in motion and my ideas and my perspectives are changing. And what an opportunity to capture. It's like it's ever evolving, and it's something that's gonna stay with them forever. So actually, can I share a story that
Yes,
really stuck with
please.
me as I was going down this process? I was in San Diego 2019 for Deeper Learning. It's a big conference that happens at High Tech High every year. And they wanted to model some alternative ways to go about assessment. And story is always a big part of what they do down there. And that probably really planted the seed for me. But they had one day where it was mostly all youth leading that day. They were the ones on the stage, which I think is brilliant in and of itself. And one girl got up. She had just graduated high school. She was 18 years old. And she basically did what they called a defensive learning. But they had all of the competencies. That their portrait of a graduate is a big phrase that people often use to describe those. So she had her portrait of a graduate up. These are the competencies that my school really values. And she told a story. And it was the most captivating. It was about 30 to 40 minutes. She had pictures. And basically, she discovered she's an entrepreneur. And it all started with, through things she was doing in class and trying to find her place and, not really fitting in with any of the clubs. She was just frustrated by the fact she had this like nagging feeling of like, I wish there was a better way to charge my phone. Like that's really where it started for her. And she learned so much science and so much math and STEM to basically create a shoe that is a charger, and it recharges while you walk, and then you can plug your your phone into your shoe, because she loved to go to concerts and to festivals and things, and she hated that her phone would die and then she wouldn't have. But anyway, she told this whole story and was reflecting on all these key moments from her entire high school journey. Like, can you imagine if at the end of every year students did that, and then at the end of a full like middle school or high school, it's like this culminating story as you're pulling in all the pieces and
Oh,
trying to figure out what most matters. And I was trying to find it on my phone, but I listened to this awesome, or I watched this awesome documentary the other night called The Girl in the Photo, which is like kind of a bit of a different take on a true crime doc. So it's
right.
not as grim as it sounds. It is grim, but they do it in a beautiful way. But the daughter, I won't tell you who she is, but at the end, there's a character that's very key. And she's talking to the camera. And I was like, oh, I've got to use this quote for the book. Again, everything goes into my notes file. She says, I'm still trying to figure out me, but I know that this story is going to help somebody. I still have to figure out all the pieces and how it shaped me. And I know that eventually I'm going to be able to share all of it. And I was
Oh,
like, that's it. That story. Like, that's the
yeah.
empowerment piece. You're constantly collecting that evidence. If you say, like, this is the vision, this is what learning is, the students will find the evidence, and we just have to create the space for them to share it.
And and all of this you're saying, number one, to see a student that you poured into, let's say that it is the portrait of a graduate at the, after their senior year, during their senior year, and let's say that you invited the teachers that had a time with this
Mm-hmm.
student were invited, like just to see those students, like, yeah, maybe you were my fifth grade student, but something that I taught you resonated, or you turned into this wonderful, whether it was, whether that happens or not, but just knowing that you poured some of yourself into the student, and now look what they're doing and look at the
Mm-hmm.
story they're telling. I just can't even imagine what it would feel like to see that, because we don't always get to see where our students end up, in life.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we do, and it's a blessing, but that is just amazing. And then I think also the millions and millions of dollars that we pour into these tests that tell us like one tiny little thing that really is not very important, that doesn't really impact the rest of their lives, in a way that
Mm-hmm.
we hope that they would be empowered and to continue growing. Sometimes I think that standardized testing does the opposite, though. It tells a story to a young person that maybe they shouldn't go in this direction, or maybe they're not who they thought they were. It kind of negates what they're learning inside as a whole person.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're talking about this, like especially the portrait of a graduate, of course, really resonates with me. But it just seems like you don't have to have a lot of money to do this. Like you can celebrate people, you can see the process of their learning and the things that they hope to do with their lives. Basically, like you said, create a space, and
Mm-hmm.
that is so empowering, and that is something that I wish that would catch fire everywhere, because it sounds beautiful. So some people are chiming in.
Yeah.
Someone says, oh, I am watching that tonight, no spoilers.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, right.
It didn't spoil anything. It's amazing, though. That's the one thing I'll say.
And I think this is still Dr. Harvey. It says, actually, for my senior class, is a big
Mm.
part of my assessment is actually
Yes.
sitting down with them and talking about the process of their learning, of what it was. And I think that a
Mhm.
lot of us do that. It just seems like, can we normalize that it's like a real part of learning, that it is
Mhm.
that summative assessment piece, that it is very subjective, but it is personal to the learner, and it means
Mhm.
even more. And we validate it as educators and as a system of public education. Can we
Mhm.
validate that as the true
Mhm.
piece of success, more than what a standardized test at the end of the year would say?
Mhm.
I just think that is true empowerment. So we are getting close to our time. And you have so much to say, and
Oh,
you're
yeah.
just a beautiful person. So I'm so glad that
Oh.
we got to interact. I've learned so much from you in this 30 minutes. And this can be, I always ask our guests, what is one piece of wisdom you'd like to share with other educators? And this can be about our conversation, or just something
Mm.
that's on your mind right now that you really just want to give voice to. But what would you like to share with others?
Mm. Wow. Yeah, I think in the context we're in, with it being uh, summer break for a lot of folks, um, the power of reflecting on your own story. I think
Hmm.
give yourself that time, give yourself that space. Like, I think we're so driven all the time to figure out everything for our students and to put their learning first and foremost, but stepping back and taking the time to actually write out key parts of your story and think about how you can use those as models. That's really given me a lot of grounding and excitement as I'm going into this work is as I'm, like you said, it's all interconnected, right? Like I'm living it while we're learning about it and trying to cultivate it. So as you head into next year, think about key stories in your learning journey. Think about a story that really impacted you when you were in school. Think
Mhm.
about a story of assessment for you, good or bad, but we all have a story related to assessment because it's very emotional, so it sticks with us. Think about stories that made you who you are today and start cultivating those stories and share them somewhere and put them somewhere so that you can come back to them again and again and refine them as you talk to more people and your perspective is expanded.
Mm. I love that. I am not going to say anything more to that because that was beautiful and it was a great way to end. Natalie, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to our community members who talked with us as well. And thank you to anybody who is listening to this live or the replay. We appreciate you so much. Please join our Spaces Educator community. You can find us on facebook.com/groups/SpacesEDU. And we can continue this amazing conversation. Natalie, congratulations on your upcoming nuptials and
Thank
just
you.
celebrating who you are. You are a powerful woman. I am
Oh,
so glad that I got to sit here with you for a few minutes today and have such a wonderful conversation because I can see you changing, making changes in education that are going to help so many. So I appreciate your time today. And we will
oh.
see you all again very soon. Have a great rest of your summer break, and we'll see you in a couple weeks. Bye, everybody.
Hi, everybody.